My skill with healing, it may not equal yours, Creel, Maurice said dryly, but I did try. The accents of Tarabon were still strong in her voice after all these years, but she wore her dark hair drawn back severely from her stern face. Catswain trusted her perhaps more than any of the others. What do we do now, Catswain? Sorelia stared at the woman stretched out on the bed with no expression beyond a thinning of her lips. Catswain wondered whether she was re-evaluating their alliance. Varen was staring at Alana too, and she looked absolutely terrified. Catswain had not thought anything could frighten Varen that far, but she felt a thrill of terror herself. If she lost this connection to the boy now... We sit down and wait for her to wake, she said in a calm voice. There was nothing else to do. Nothing.
Where is he? Demandred growled, clenching his fists behind his back. Standing with his feet apart, he was aware that he dominated the room. He always did. Even so, he wished Semirhage or Masana were present. Their alliance was delicate, a simple agreement that they would not turn on one another until the others had been eliminated. Yet it had held all this time. Working together, they had unbalanced opponent after opponent, toppling many to their deaths or worse. But it was difficult for Semirhage to attend these meetings, and Masana had been shy of late. If she was thinking of ending the alliance... Althor has been seen in 5 cities, including that cursed place in the waste, and a dozen towns since those blind fools, those idiots, failed in Kyrian. And that only includes the reports we have. The Great Lord only knows what else is crawling toward us by horse or sheep or whatever else these savages can find to carry a message. Grendel had chosen the setting, since she had been first to arrive, and it irritated him. View walls made the striped wooden floor appear to be surrounded by a forest full of brightly flowered vines and fluttering birds that were even more colorful. Sweet scents and soft bird calls filled the air. Only the arch of the doorway spoiled the illusion. Why did she want a reminder of what was lost? They could as soon make shock lances or show wings as a view wall outside of this place, close to Shale Ghul. In any case, she despised anything to do with nature, as he recalled. Osangar frowned at idiots and blind fools, as well he might, but he quickly smoothed that plain, creased face, so unlike the one he had been born with. By whatever name he was called, he had always known who he dared challenge and who not. A matter of chance, he said calmly, though he did begin dry-washing his hands. An old habit. He was garbed like some ruler of this age, in a coat so heavy with golden embroidery that it almost hid the red of the cloth, and boots fringed with golden tassels. There was enough white lace at his neck and wrists to clothe a child. The man had never known the meaning of excess. If not for his particular skills, he never would have been chosen.
1 second, everyone.
Realizing what his hands were doing, Osangar snatched the tall Quaindiar wine glass from the round table beside his chair and inhaled the dark wine's aroma deeply. Simply probabilities, he murmured, trying to sound offhand. Next time, he will be killed or taken. Chance can't protect him forever. You are going to depend on chance. Arengar was stretched out in a long, flowing chair, as though it were a bed chair. Directing a smoky smile at Osangar, she arched one leg on bare toes, so the slit in her bright red skirts exposed her to the hip. Every breath threatened to free her from the red satin that just contained her full breasts. All of her mannerisms had changed since she became a woman, but not the core of what had been placed into that female body. Demandred hardly scorned fleshly pleasures, but one day her cravings would be the death of her, as they already had been once. Not that he would mourn, of course, if the next time was final. You were responsible for watching him, Osangar, she went on, her voice caressing every syllable. You and Demandred. Osangar flinched, flicking his tongue against his lips, and she laughed throatily. My own charge is... She pressed a thumb down on the edge of the chair as if pinning something, and laughed again. I should think you would be more worried, Arengar, Grendel murmured over her wine. She concealed her contempt about as well as the almost transparent silvery mist of her streath gown concealed her ripe curves. You and Osengar and Demandred, and Moradin, wherever he is, perhaps you should fear Arthur's success as much as his failure. Laughing, Arengar caught the standing woman's hand in one of hers. Her green eyes sparkled. And perhaps you could explain what you mean better if we were alone. Grendel's gown turned to stark black, concealing smoke. Jerking her hand free with a coarse oath, she stalked away from the chair. Arengar giggled. What do you mean? Osengar said sharply, struggling out of his chair. Once on his feet, he struck a lecturer's pose, gripping his lapels, and his tone became pedantic. In the first place, my dear Grendel, I doubt that even I could devise a method to remove the Great Lord's shadow from Saidin. Arthur is a primitive. Anything he tries inevitably will prove insufficient, and I, for one, cannot believe he can even imagine how to begin. In any event, we will stop him trying because the Great Lord commands it. I can understand fear of the Great Lord's displeasure if we somehow failed, unlikely as that might be. But why should those of us you named have any special fear? Blind as ever, and dry as ever, Grendel murmured. With a return of composure, her gown was clear mist again, though red. Perhaps she was not so calm as she pretended, or perhaps she wanted them to believe she was controlling some agitation. Except for the streath, her adornments all came from this age, fire drops in her golden hair, a large ruby dangling between her breasts, ornate golden bracelets on both wrists, and something quite strange that Demandred wondered whether anyone else had noticed. A simple ring of gold on the little finger of her left hand. Simple was never associated with Grendel. If the young man does somehow remove the shadow, well, you who channel Saidin will no longer need the Great Lord's special protection. Will he trust your loyalty, then? Smiling, she sipped her wine. Osengar did not smile. His face paled, and he scrubbed a hand across his mouth. Arengar sat up on the edge of her long chair, no longer trying to be sensuous. Her hands formed claws on her lap, and she glared at Grendel as if ready to go for her throat. Demandred's fists unclenched. It was out in the open at last. He had hoped to have Althor dead, or failing that, captive, before this suspicion reared its head. During the War of Power, more than a dozen of the Chosen had died of the Great Lord's suspicion. The Great Lord is sure you are all faithful, Moradin announced, striding in as though he were the Great Lord of the Dark himself. He seemed to believe he was, and the boy's face he wore now had not changed that. In spite of his words, that face was grim, and his unrelieved black made his name, Death, fit. You need not worry until he stops being sure. The girl, Sindane, trotted at his heels like a bosomy little silver-haired pet in red and black. For some reason, Moradin had a rat riding his shoulder, pale nose sniffing the air, black eyes studying the room warily. Or for no reason, perhaps. A youthful face had not made him any saner, either. Why have you called us here? Demandred demanded. I have much to do and no time for idle talk. Unconsciously, he tried to stand taller to match the other man. Messana is absent again, Moradin said, instead of answering. A pity. She should hear what I have to say. Plucking the rat from his shoulder by its tail, he watched the animal wave its legs futilely. Nothing except the rat seemed to exist for him. Small, apparently unimportant matters can become very important, he murmured. This rat, whether Esam succeeds in finding and killing that other vermin, Thane, a word whispered in the wrong ear or not spoken to the right. A butterfly stirs its wings on a branch, and on the other side of the world a mountain collapses. Suddenly the rat twisted, trying to sink its teeth into his wrist. Casually, he flung the creature away. In midair, there was a burst of flame, something hotter than flame, and the rat was gone. Moradin smiled. Demandred flinched in spite of himself. That had been the true power. He had felt nothing. A black speck floated across Moradin's blue eyes, then another in a steady stream. The man must have been using the true power exclusively since he last saw him to gain so many saw so quickly. He himself had never touched the true power except at need. Great need. Of course, only Moradin had that privilege now, since his anointing. The man truly was insane to use it so freely. It was a drug more addictive than iodine, more deadly than poison. Crossing the striped floor, Moradin laid a hand on Osengar's shoulder, his smile made more ominous by the saw. The shorter man swallowed and gave a wavering smile in return. It is well you've never considered how to remove the Great Lord's shadow, Moradin said quietly. How long had he been outside? Osengar's smile grew even more sickly. Althor is not as wise as you. Tell them, Sindane. The little woman drew herself up. By face and form, she was a luscious plum, ready for plucking, but her big blue eyes were glacial.
Hey, Kobe. Nothing. I'm just listening to a
Peaches
audio book.
Here and now. You recall the Jordan call, I suppose. No amount of effort could make that low, breathy voice anything except sultry, but she managed to inject sarcasm. Luz Theron has 2 of the access keys, 1 for each. And he knows a woman strong enough to use the female of the pair. He plans to use the Jordan call for his deed. Nearly everyone began to talk at once. I thought the keys were all destroyed, Arengar exclaimed, surging to her feet. Her eyes were wide with fear. He could shatter the world just trying to use the Jordan call. If you had ever read anything besides a history book, you would know they're almost impossible to destroy, Osengar snarled at her. But he was tugging at his collar, as if it were too tight, and his eyes seemed ready to fall out of his face.
They are.
How can this girl know he has them? Ow! Grendel's wineglass had dropped from her hand as soon as the words were out of Sindane's mouth, bouncing end over end across the floor. Her gown turned as crimson as fresh blood, and her mouth twisted as if she were going to vomit. And you've just been hoping to blunder into him, she screamed at Demandred. Hoping someone will find him for you. Fool! Fool! Demandred thought Grendel had been a touch flamboyant even for her. He would wager the announcement had been no surprise to her.
I got my face, I got a top of my head, side of my head.
A hand over his heart, for all the world like a lover.
My arms.
Moradin tilted up Sindane's chin on his fingertips. Resentment burned in her eyes, but her face might have been a doll's unchanging face. She certainly accepted his attentions like a pliable doll. Sindane knows many things, Moradin said softly. And she tells me everything she knows. Everything. The tiny woman's expression never altered, but she trembled visibly. She was a puzzle to Demandred. At first, he had thought she was Lanfear reincarnated. Bodies for transmigration supposedly were chosen by what was available. Yet Osengar and Arengar were proof of the great Lord's cruel sense of humor.
Just to
he had been
get him, because I've run out of room.
Told him the girl was weaker than Lanfear. Nasana and the rest thought she was of this age. Yet she spoke of Althor as Luz Theron, just as Lanfear had, and spoke of the Cho'an Kal as one familiar with the terror they had inspired during the War of Power. Only balefire had been more feared, and only just. Or had Moradin taught her for purposes of his own, if he had any real purposes? There had always been times when the man's actions had been sheer madness. Though it seems he must be killed after all, Demandred said. Hiding his satisfaction was not easy. Randall Thor, or Luz Theron Telamon, he would rest easier when the fellow was dead. Before he can destroy the world, and us, which makes finding him all the more urgent. Killed? Moradin moved his hands as though weighing something. To that, yeah, he said finally. But finding him is no problem. When he touches the Jordan Kal, you'll know where he is. And you'll go there and take him. Or kill him, if necessary. The Nameless has spoken. As the Nameless commands, Sindane said eagerly, bowing her head, and echoes of her ran around the room. Though Arengar sounded sullen, Osengar desperate, and Grendel oddly thoughtful. Bending his neck hurt Demandred as much as speaking those words. So they...
Yeah, you have a good night, too. Definitely appreciate you stopping by.
No less. He and some woman drinking enough of the one power to melt continents. But there had been no indication that Moradin would be with them. Or his twin pets, Mogadin and Sindane. The man was nameless for now, but perhaps he could arrange so he could have the body the next time he did. Perhaps it could be arranged soon.
Chapter 14. What a Veil Hides. The Victory of Kidron rolled on long sea swells, making the gilded lamps in the stern cabin swing on their gimbals, but Tuon sat calmly as the razor in Selusha's sure hand slid across her scalp. Through the tall stern windows she could see other great ships crashing through the gray-green swells in sprays of white, hundreds of them, row on row, stretching to the horizon. 4 times as many had been left at Tanchico. The Friagel, those who come home, the Karen, the return, had begun. A soaring albatross seemed to be following the Kidron, an omen of victory indeed, though the bird's long wings were black instead of white. It must still mean the same thing. Omens did not change according to location. An owl calling at dawn meant death, and rain without clouds an unexpected visitor, whether in Imfaral or Noran Mashar. The morning ritual with her dresser's razor was soothing, and she needed that today. Last night she had given a command in anger. No command should be issued in anger. She felt almost Sai-Mosief, as if she had lost honor. Her balance was disturbed, and that boded as ill for the return as a loss of sight-tear, albatross or no albatross. Selusha wiped away the last of the lather with a warm, damp cloth, then used a dry cloth, and finally powdered her smooth scalp lightly with a brush. When her dresser stepped back, Tuon rose and let her elaborately embroidered blue silk dressing gown slide to the gold and blue patterned carpet. Instantly the cool air pebbled her dark, bare skin. 4 of her 10 maids rose gracefully from where they had been kneeling against the walls, clean-limbed and comely in their filmy white robes. All had been purchased for their appearance as much as their skills, and they were very skilled. They had become used to the motions of the ship during the long voyage from Shan-Chen, and they scurried to fetch the garments that had already been laid out atop the carved chests and bring them to Selusha. Selusha never allowed the Daco veil to actually dress her, not so much as stockings or slippers. When she settled a pleated gown the color of well-aged ivory over Tuon's head, the younger woman could not help comparing the two of them in the tall mirror fastened to the inner wall. Golden-haired Selusha possessed a stately, cream-skinned beauty and cool blue eyes. Anyone might have taken her for one of the blood, and of high rank, rather than Sojin, if the left side of her head had not been shaved. A notion that would have shocked the woman to the quick, expressed aloud. The very idea of any stepping above her appointed station horrified Selusha. Tuon knew she herself would never have such a commanding presence. Her eyes were too large and a liquid brown. When she forgot to keep a stern mask, her heart-shaped face belonged on a mischievous child. The top of her head barely came to Selusha's eyes, and her dresser was not a tall woman. Tuon could ride with the best. She excelled at wrestling and the use of bendable weapons, but she had always had to make herself known to impress. She had trained that fool as hard as she had trained every other talent combined. Perhaps the wide woven belt of gold emphasized her waist enough that she would not be taken for a boy in a dress. Men watched when Selusha passed by, and Tuon had overheard some murmur about her full breasts. Perhaps that had nothing to do with a commanding presence, but it would have been nice to possess a little more bosom. The lights are friendly, Selusha murmured, sounding weak, as the Daco Vale hurried back to kneel upright against the walls. You've done that every morning since the first day your head was shaved. Do you still think after 3 years that I'll leave a patch of stubble? Tuon realized that she had rubbed a hand across her bare scalp. Searching for stubble, she admitted to herself ruefully. If you did, she said with mock severity, I would have you beaten. A repayment for all the time you used to switch on me. Placing a rope of rubies around Tuon's neck, Selusha laughed. If you pay me back for all that, I'll never be able to sit down again. Tuon smiled. Selusha's mother had given her to Tuon for a cradle gift, to be her nursemaid, and more important, her shadow, a bodyguard no one knew about. The first 25 years of Selusha's life had been training for those jobs, training in secret for the second. On Tuon's 16th naming day, when her head was first shaved, she had made the traditional gifts of her house to Selusha, a small estate for the care she had shown, a pardon for the chastisements she had given, a sack of 100 golden thrones for each time she had needed to punish her charge. The blood assembled to watch her presented as an adult for the first time had been impressed by all those sacks of coin, more than many of them could have laid hand on themselves. She had been unruly as a child, not to mention headstrong. And the one traditional gift was the offer for Selusha to choose where she would be appointed next. Tuon was not sure whether she or the watching crowd had been more astonished when the dignified woman turned her back on power and authority and asked instead to be Tuon's dresser, her chief maid, and her shadow still, of course, though that was not made public. She herself had been delighted. Perhaps in small doses, spread over 16 years, she said. Catching sight of herself in the mirror, she held her smile long enough to make sure there was no sting in her words, then replaced it with sternness. She certainly felt more affection for the woman who had raised her than for the mother she had seen only twice a year before becoming an adult, or the brothers and sisters she had been taught from her first steps to battle for their mother's favor. 2 of them had died in those struggles so far, and 3 had tried to kill her. A sister and a brother had been made Daco Vale and had their names stricken from the records as firmly as if it had been discovered they could channel. Her place was far from secure even now. A single misstep could see her dead, or worse, stripped and sold on the public block. Blessings of the light. When she smiled, she still looked 16, at best. Chuckling, Selusha turned to take the close-fitting cap of golden lace from its red-lacquered stand on the dressing table. The sparse lace would expose most of her shaven scalp and mark her with the raven and roses. Perhaps she was not Sai Mosief, but for the sake of the Koren, she had to restore her balance. She could ask Anath, her Sophia, to administer a penance, but it was less than 2 years since Neferi's unexpected death, and she still was not entirely comfortable with her replacement. Something told her she must do this on her own. Perhaps she had seen an omen she had not recognized consciously. Ants were not likely on the ship. All sorts of beetles. No, Selusha, she said quietly. A veil. Selusha's mouth tightened in disapproval, but she replaced the cap on its stand silently. In private, as now, she had license to free her tongue, yet she knew what could be spoken and what not. Tuon had only ever had to have her punished twice, and Light's truth she had regretted it as much as Selusha. Wordlessly, her weapon produced a long, sheer veil, draping it over Tuon's head and securing it with a narrow band of golden braids set with rubies. Even more transparent than the Daco veil's robes, the veil did not hide her face at all, but it hid what was most important. Laying a long gold-embroidered cape on Tuon's shoulders, Selucia stepped back and bowed softly, the end of her golden veil touching the carpet. The reeling Daco veil bowed their faces to the deck. Privacy was about to end. Tuon left the cabin alone. In the second cabin stood 6 of her Suldam, 3 to either side, with their charges kneeling in front of them on the wide, polished planks of the deck. The Suldam straightened when they saw her, proud as the silver lightning in the red panels on their skirts. The gray-clad Domani knelt full of their own pride, except for poor Lydia, who crouched over her knees and tried to press her tear-stained face against the deck. Ianel, holding the red-haired Domani's leash, scowled down at her. Tuon sighed. Lydia had been responsible for her anger last night. No, she had caused it, but Tuon herself was responsible for her own emotions. She had commanded the Domani to read her fortune, and she should not have ordered her caned because she disliked what she heard. Bending, she touched Lydia's chin, laying long, red-enameled fingernails against the Domani's freckled cheek, and drew her up to sit on her heels, which produced a wince and a fresh set of tears that Tuon carefully wiped away with her fingers as she pulled the Domani upright on her knees. "Lydia is a good Domani, Ianel," she said. "Paint her welts with tincture of sorfa, and give her lionheart for the pain until the welts are gone. And until they are gone, she is to have a sweet custard with every meal." "As the High Lady commands," Ianel replied formally, but she smiled slightly. All the Suldam were fond of Lydia, and she had not liked punishing the Domani. "If she gets fat, I will take her for runs, High Lady." Lydia twisted her head around to kiss Tuon's palm and murmured, "Lydia's mistress is kind. Lydia will not get fat." Making her way along the 2 lines, Tuon spoke a few words to each person and petted each of the Domani. The 6 she had brought with her were her best, and they beamed at her with a fondness equal to hers for them. They had competed eagerly to be chosen. Plump, yellow-haired Dali and Dani, sisters who hardly needed a Suldam's direction. Charol, her hair as gray as her eyes, but still the most agile in her spinning. Sarah, with red ribbons in her tightly curled black hair, the strongest, and proud of the Suldam. Tiny Mylan, shorter even than Tuon herself. Mylan was Tuon's special pride among the 6. Many had thought it odd when Tuon tested for Suldam on reaching adulthood, though none could gainsay her then, except her mother, who had allowed it by remaining silent. Actually becoming a Suldam was unthinkable, of course, but she found as much enjoyment in training Domani as in training horses, and she was as good at one as the other. Mylan was the proof of that. The pale little Domani had been half dead with shock and fear, refusing to eat or drink, when Tuon bought her on the docks at Shon Kifar. The Der Suldam all had despaired, saying she would not live long, but now Mylan smiled up at Tuon and leaned forward to kiss her hand before she even reached to stroke the Domani's dark hair. Once skin and bones, she was becoming a trifle plump. Instead of rebuking her, Catrona, who held her leash, let a smile crease her usually stern black face, and murmured that Mylan was a perfect Domani. It was true. No one would believe now that once she had called herself Aes Sedai. Before leaving, Tuon gave a few orders concerning the Domani's diet and exercise. The Suldam knew what to do, just like the other 12 in Tuon's entourage, or they would not have been in her service, but she believed no one should be allowed to own Domani unless they took an active interest. She knew the quirks of every one of hers as well as she knew her own face. In the outer cabin, the Death Watch guards, lining the walls in armor lacquered blood red and nearly black-green, stiffened at her entrance. That is, they stiffened if statues could be said to stiffen. Hard-faced men, they and 500 more like them had been charged personally with her safety. Any or all would die to protect her. They would die if she did. Every man had volunteered, asked to be in her guard. Seeing the veil, grizzled Captain Messenge ordered only 2 to accompany her on deck, where 24 Ogier gardeners in the red and green made a line to either side of the doorway, great black-tasseled axes upright in front of them, and grim eyes watching for any danger even here. They would not die if she did, but they also had asked to be in her guard, and she would rest her life in any of those huge hands without a qualm. The ribbed sails on the Kidron's 3 tall masts were taut with the cold wind that drove the vessel toward the land that lay ahead, a dark shore near enough that she could make out hills and headlands. Men and women filled the deck, all of the blood on the vessel in their finest silks, ignoring the wind that whipped their cloaks as they ignored the barefoot men and women of the ship's crew who darted between them. Some of the nobles were much too ostentatious about ignoring the crew, as though they could run the ship while kneeling or bowing every 2 paces. Prepared for prostration, the blood made slight bows instead, one equal to another, when they saw her veil. Uriel, the sharp-nosed man everyone thought was her secretary, went to one knee. He was her secretary, of course, but also her hand, commanding her seekers. The Makura woman flung herself down prostrate and kissed the deck before a few quiet words from Uriel made her get back to her feet, blushing and smoothing her pleated red skirts. Tuon had been uncertain about taking her into service back in Tanchico, but the woman had pleaded like a Daco veil. She hated Aes Sedai in her bones for some reason, and despite the rewards already given for her extremely valuable information, she hoped to do them more injury. Bowing her head to the blood, Tuon climbed to the quarterdeck, followed by the 2 Deathwatch guards. The wind made handling her cape difficult, and pressed her veil against her face one moment, then flailed it over her head the next. It did not matter. That she wore it was sufficient. Her personal banner, 2 golden lions harnessed to an ancient war cart, flew at the stern above the 6 helmsmen struggling to control the long tiller. The Raven and Roses would have been packed away as soon as the first crewman to see her veil could pass the word. Kidron's captain, a wide, weathered woman with white hair and the most incredible green eyes, bowed as Tuon's slipper touched the quarterdeck, then immediately returned her attention to her ship. Anath was standing by the railing in unrelieved black silk, outwardly undisturbed by the chill wind in spite of her lack of a cloak or cape. A slender woman, she would have been tall even for a man. Her charcoal dark face was beautiful, but her large black eyes seemed to pierce like awls. Tuon's Sophia, her truth speaker, named by the Empress, might she live forever, when Neferi died. A surprise, with Neferi's left hand trained and ready to replace her, but when the Empress spoke from the crystal throne, her word was law. You certainly were not supposed to be afraid of your Sophia, yet Tuon was, a little. Joining the woman, she gripped the railing, and had to loosen her hands before she broke a lacquered nail. That would have meant very bad luck. So, Anath said, the word like a nail driven into Tuon's skull. The tall woman frowned down at her, and contempt lay thick in her voice. You hide your face, in a way, and now you are just the High Lady Tuon, except that everyone still knows who you really are, even if they won't mention it. How long do you intend carrying on this farce? Anath's full lips sneered, and she made a curt, dismissive gesture with one slim hand. I suppose this idiocy is over having the Damani caned. You are a fool to think your eyes are downcast by a little thing like that. What did she say to make you angry? No one seems to know, except that you threw a tantrum I am sorry to have missed. Tuon made her hands be still on the railing. They wanted to tremble. She forced her face to maintain a stern appearance. I will wear the veil until an omen tells me the time has come to remove it, Anath, she said, schooling her voice to calm. Only luck had kept anyone from overhearing Lydia's cryptic words. Everyone knew that Damani could foretell the future, and if any of the blood had heard, they would all have been chattering behind their hands about her fate. Anath laughed rudely and began telling her again what a fool she was, in greater detail this time. Much greater detail. She did not bother to lower her voice. Captain Tehan was staring straight ahead, but her eyes were almost falling out of her lined face. Tuan listened attentively, though her cheeks grew hotter and hotter until she thought her veil might burst into flame. Many of the blood called their voices Sophia, but voices of the blood were Sojin, and knew they could be punished if their owners were displeased by what they said, even if they were called Sophia. A speaker of truth could not be bound or coerced or punished in any way. A truth speaker was required to tell the stark truth whether or not you wanted to hear it, and to make sure that you heard. Those blood who called their voices Sophia thought that Alguin, the last man to sit on the crystal throne almost 1,000 years ago, had been insane because he let his Sophia live and continue in her post after she slapped his face before the entire course. They did not understand the traditions of her family any more than the goggle-eyed captain did. The Death Watch guards' expressions never altered behind the half-concealing cheek pieces of their helmets. They understood. "Thank you, but I do not need a penance," she said politely, when Anath finally ceased her harangue. Once, after she cursed Neferi for dying by something as stupid as a fall downstairs, she had asked her new Sophia to perform that service for her. Cursing the dead was enough to make you Saimosiev for months. The woman had been almost tender about it, in an odd fashion, though she left her weeping for days, unable to don even a shift. That was not why she refused the offer, though. A penance must be severe, or it was useless in redressing balance. No, she would not take the easier way because she had made her decision,
over here playing,
and she had to admit because she wanted to resist her Sophia's advice. Wanted not to listen to her at all.
Shadow Legends.
As Selucia said, she always had been headstrong. Refusing to listen to your truth speaker was abominable. Perhaps she should accept, after all, to redress her. 3 long gray porpoises rose beside the ship and sounded. 3, and they did not rise again. Hold to your chosen course. "When we are ashore," she said, "the High Lady Suroth must be commended. Hold to your chosen course. And her ambition must be looked into. She has done more with the Forerunners than the Empress, may she live forever, dreamed of. But success on such a scale often breeds ambitions to match." Peeved at the change of subject, Anath drew herself up, lips compressing. Her eyes glittered. "I'm sure Suroth has only the best intentions of the Empire for ambition," she said curtly. Tuan nodded. She herself was not sure at all. That sort of thing could lead to the Tower of the Ravens, perhaps especially for her. "I must find a way to make contact with the Dragon Leader as soon as possible. He must kneel before the throne before Tarman Gaiden, or all is lost. The prophecies of the dragon said so, clearly." Anath's mood changed in a flash. Smiling, she laid a hand on Tuan's shoulder almost possessively. That was going too far, but she was Sophia, and the feel of Anath might have been only in Tuan's eyes. "You must be careful," Anath purred. "You must not let him learn how dangerous you are to him until it is too late for him to escape." She had more advice, but Tuan let it wash over her. She listened enough to hear, yet it was nothing she had not heard 100 times before. Ahead of the ship she could make out the mouth of a great harbor, Ebudar, from where the Koren would spread as it was spreading from Tanchico. The thought gave her a thrill of pleasure, of accomplishment. Behind her veil she was merely the High Lady Tuan, of no higher rank than many others of the blood. But in her heart, always, she was Tuan Athaim Cora Paindrag, daughter of the 9 moons, and she had come to reclaim what had been stolen from her ancestor.
Chapter 15. In Need of a Bell Founder. The box-like wagon reminded Matt of tinker wagons he had seen, a little house on wheels, though this one, filled with cabinets and workbenches built into the walls, made for a dwelling. Wrinkling his nose at the odd, acrid smells that filled the interior, he shifted uncomfortably on his 3-legged stool, the only place for anyone to sit. His broken leg and ribs were near enough healed, and the cuts that he had suffered when that whole bloody building fell on his head, but the injuries still pained him now and then. Besides, he was hoping for sympathy. Women loved to show sympathy, if you played it out right. He made himself stop twisting his long signet ring on his finger. Let a woman know you were nervous, and she put her own construction on it, and sympathy went right out the window. "Listen, Alundra," he said, assuming his most winning smile. "By this time you must know the Shanshan won't look twice at fireworks. Those Damani do something called skylights that makes your best fireworks look like a few sparks flying up the chimney, so I hear. You know what that's meant. Me, I have not seen these so-called skylights myself," she replied dismissively in her strong Tarabana accent. Her head was bent over a wooden mortar the size of a large keg on one of the workbenches, and despite a wide blue ribbon gathering her dark, waist-length hair loosely at the nape of her neck, it fell forward to hide her face. The long white apron with its dark smudges did nothing to conceal how well her dark green dress fit over her hips, but he was more interested in what she was doing. Well, as interested. She was grinding at a coarse black powder with a wooden pestle nearly as long as her arm. The powder looked a little like what he had seen inside fireworks he had cut open, but he still did not know what went into it. "In any event," she went on, unaware of his scrutiny, "I will not give you the guild's secrets. You must understand this, yes?" Matt winced. He had been working on her for days to bring it to this point, ever since a chance visit to Valan Luca's traveling show revealed that she was here in Ebudar, and all the while he had dreaded that she would mention the Illuminators Guild. "But you aren't an Illuminator anymore, remember? They kicked, you said you left the guild." Not for the first time, he considered a small reminder that he had once saved her from 4 guild members who wanted to cut her throat. That sort of thing was enough to make most women fall on your neck with kisses and offers of whatever you wanted. But there had been a notable lack of kisses when he actually saved her, so it was unlikely she would begin now. "Anyway," he went on airily, "you don't have to worry about the guild. You've been making night flowers for how long? And nobody has come around trying to stop you. Why, I'll wager you never see another Illuminator." "What have you heard?" she asked quietly, her head still down. The pestle's rotation slowed almost to a stop. "Tell me." The hair on his scalp nearly stood on end. How did women do that? Hide every clue, and they still went straight to what you wanted to conceal. "What do you mean? I hear the same gossip you do, I suppose. Mostly about Shanshan." She spun around so fast that her hair swung like a flail, and snatched the heavy pestle up in both hands, brandishing it overhead. Perhaps 10 years or so older than he, she had large dark eyes and a small plump mouth that usually seemed ready to be kissed. He had thought about kissing her a time or two. Most women were more amenable after a few kisses. Now her teeth were bared, and looked ready to bite off his nose. "Tell me," she commanded. "I was playing at dice with some Shanshan down near the docks," he said reluctantly, keeping a careful eye on the upraised pestle. A man might bluff and bluster and walk away if the matter was not serious, but a woman could crack your skull on a whim. And his hip was aching and stiff from sitting too long. He was not sure how quickly he could move from that stool. "I didn't want to be the one to tell you, but the guild doesn't exist anymore. The chapter house in Tanchico is gone." That had been the only real chapter house in the guild. The one in Kyrian was long abandoned now, and for the rest, Illuminators only traveled to put on displays for rulers and nobles. They refused to let Shanshan soldiers inside the compound, and fought. Tried to, when they broke in anyway. I don't know what happened. Maybe a soldier took a lantern where he shouldn't have, but half the compound exploded, as I understand it. Probably exaggeration, but the Shanshan believed one of the Illuminators used the one power, and they... He sighed and tried to make his voice gentle. Blood and ashes, he did not want to tell her this. But she was a bloody claw to split his scalp. "Aludra, the Shanshan gathered up everyone left alive at the chapter house and some Illuminators that had gone to Amador. and everybody in between who even looked like an illuminator. And they made them all duck or veil. That means... I know what it means, she said fiercely. Swinging back to the big mortar, she began pounding away with the pestle so hard that he was afraid the thing might explode if that powder really was what went inside fireworks. Fools, she muttered angrily, thumping the pestle loudly in the mortar. Great blind fools! With the mighty you must bend your neck a little and walk on. But they would not see it. Sniffing, she scrubbed at her cheeks with the back of her hand. You are wrong, my young friend. So long as one illuminator lives, the guild, it lives too. And me, I still live. Still not looking at him, she wiped her cheeks with her hand again. And what would you do if I gave you the fireworks? Heard the Shan from the catapult, I suppose? Her snort told what she thought of that. And what's wrong with the idea? He asked defensively. A good field catapult, a scorpion, could throw a 10-pound stone 500 paces, and 10 pounds of fireworks would do more damage than any stone. Anyway, I have a better idea. I saw those tubes you used to toss night flowers into the sky. 300 paces or more, you said. Tip one on its side, more or less, and I'll bet I could toss a night flower 1,000 paces. Peering into the mortar, she muttered almost under her breath. Me, I talk too much, he thought it was, and something about pretty eyes that made no sense. He hurried on to stop her from starting up about guild secrets again. Those tubes are a lot smaller than a catapult, Aludra. If they were well hidden, the Shonchan would never know where they came from. You could think of it as paying them back for the chapter house. Turning her head, she gave him a look of respect. Mingled with surprise, he managed to ignore that. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and there were tear stains on her cheeks. Maybe if he put an arm around her. Women usually appreciated a little comforting when they cried. Before he could even shift his weight, she swung the pestle between them, pointing it at him like a sword with one hand. Those slender arms must be stronger than they looked. The wooden club never wavered. Light, he thought. She couldn't have known what I was going to do. This is not bad, for one who only saw the lofting tubes a few days ago, she said. But me, I have thought about this long before you. I had reason. For a moment, her voice was bitter, but it smoothed out again, and became a little amused. I will set you the puzzle, since you are so clever, no? She said, arching an eyebrow. Oh, she definitely was amused by something. You tell me what use I might have for a bell founder, and I will tell you all of my secrets. Even the ones that will make you blush, yes? Now that did sound interesting. But the fireworks were more important than an hour snuggling with her. What secrets did she have that could make him blush? He might surprise her there. Not all of those other men's memories that had been stuffed into his head had to do with battles. A bell maker, he mused, without a notion of where to go from there. None of those old memories gave even a hint. Well, I suppose a bell maker could... maybe... No, she said, suddenly brisk. You will go and return in 2 or 3 days. I have the work to do, and you are distracting with all of your questions and wheedling. No arguments. You will go now. Glowering, he rose and clapped his wide-brimmed black hat onto his head. Wheedling? Wheedling? Blood and bloody ashes. He had dropped his cloak in a heap by the door on entering, and he grunted softly, bending to pick it up. He had been sitting on that stool most of the day, but maybe he had made a little headway with her. If he could solve her puzzle, anyway. Alarm bells. Gongs to sound the hour. It made no sense. I might think of kissing such a smart young man as you, If he did not belong to another, she murmured in decidedly worn tones. You have such a pretty bottom. He jerked erect, keeping his back to her. The heat in his face was pure outrage, but she was sure to say he was blushing. He could usually manage to forget what he was wearing, unless someone brought it up. There had been an incident or three in taverns. While he was flat on his back with his leg in splints and his ribs strapped and bandages just about everywhere else, Tylen had hidden all of his clothes. He had not found where yet, but surely they were hidden, not burned. After all, she could not mean to hold on to him forever. All that remained of his own were his hat and the black silk scarf tied around his neck, and the silvery foxhead medallion, of course, hanging on a leather cord under his shirt, and his knives. He really would have felt lost without those. When he finally managed to crawl out of that bloody bed, the bloody woman had had new clothes made for him, with her sitting there watching the bloody seamstresses measure and fit him. Snowy lace on his wrists almost hid his bloody hands unless he was careful, and more spilled from his neck almost to his flaming waist. Tylen liked lace on a man. His coat was a brilliant scarlet, as red as his too tight breeches, and edged with golden scrollwork and white roses of all bloody things, not to mention a white oval on his left shoulder, with House Mitsubar's green sword and anchor. His coat was blue enough for a tinker, worked in red and gold Tyran mazes across the chest and down the sleeves for good measure. He did not like recalling what he had been forced to go through to convince Tylen to leave off the pearls and sapphires, and Elida alone knew what else she had wanted. And it was short, to boot. Indecently short. Tylen liked his bloody bottom, too, and she did not seem to mind who saw it. Settling the cloak around his shoulders, it was some covering at least. He grabbed his shoulder-high walking staff from where it was leaning beside the door. His hip and leg were going to ache until he could walk the pain away. In 2 or 3 days, then, he said, with as much dignity as he could muster. Eludra laughed softly. Not softly enough that he could not hear, though. Light, but a woman could laugh and a dockside string of curses, and just as deliberately. Limping out of the wagon, he slammed the door behind him as soon as he was far enough down the wooden steps that were fastened to the wagon bed. The afternoon sky was just like the morning sky had been, gray and blustery, thatched with sullen clouds. A sharp wind gusted fitfully. Altara had no true winter, but what it did have was enough to be going on with. Rather than snow, there were icy rains and thunderstorms racing in off the sea, and in between it was damp enough to make the cold seem harder. The ground had a sodden feel under your boots even when it was dry. Scowling, he hobbled away from the wagon. Women. Eludra was pretty, though, and she did know how to make fireworks. A bell thunder? Maybe he could make it a short 2 days, so long as Eludra did not start chasing him. A good many women seemed to be doing that of late. Had Tylen changed something about him to make women pursue him the way she herself did? No, that was ridiculous. The wind caught his cloak, flaring it behind him, but he was too absorbed to master it. A pair of slender women, acrobats, he thought, gave him sly smiles as they and he smiled and Tylen had not changed him. He was still the same man he had always been. Luca's show was 50 times as large as what Tom had told him about, maybe more. A sprawling hodgepodge of tents and wagons the size of a large village. Despite the weather, a number of performers were practicing where he could see them. A woman in a flowing white blouse and breeches as tight as his swung back and forth on a sagging rope slung between 2 tall poles, then threw herself off and somehow caught her feet in the rope just before she hurtled to the ground below. Then she twisted to catch the rope with her hands, pulled herself back to her seat, and began the same thing again. Not far off, a fellow was running on top of an egg-shaped wheel. It must have been a good 20 feet long, mounted on a platform that put him higher above the ground when he dashed across the narrow end than the woman who was going to break her full neck soon. Matt eyed a bare-chested man who was rolling 3 shiny balls along his arms and across his shoulders without ever touching them with his hands. That was interesting. He might be able to manage that himself. At least those balls would not leave you bleeding and broken. He had had enough of that to suit him in a lifetime. What really caught his eyes, however, were the horse lines. Long horse lines, where 24 men bundled against the cold were shoveling dung into barrows. Hundreds of horses. Supposedly, Luca had given shelter to some Shonshen animal trainer, and his reward had been a warrant signed by the High Lady Suroth herself, allowing him to keep all of his animals. Matt's own pips was secure, saved from the lottery ordered by Suroth because he was in the Tarasin Palace stables, but getting the gelding out of those stables was beyond him. Tylin, as good as had a leash around his neck, and she did not intend to let him go any time soon. Turning away, he considered having Vannin steal some of the show's horses if the talks with Luca went badly. From what Matt knew of Vannin, it would be an evening stroll for the unlikely man. Fat as he was, Vannin could steal and ride any horse ever foaled. Unfortunately, Matt doubted he himself could sit a saddle for more than a mile. Still, it was something to consider. He was growing desperate. Limping along, idly eyeing tumblers and jugglers and acrobats at their practice, he wondered how matters had come to this pass. Blood and ashes. He was Taviran. He was supposed to shape the world around him. But here he was, stuck in Ebudar, Tylan's pet and toy. The woman had not even let him heal completely before leaping on him again like a duck on a beetle, while everyone else was having a fine time of it. With those kinswomen fawning at her heels, likely Nynaeve was lording it over everyone in sight. Once Egwene realized those stark raving mad Aes Sedai who had named her Amerlin did not really mean it, Talmanas and the Band of the Red Hand were ready to spirit her away. Light Elaine might be wearing the rose crown by now, if he knew her. Rand and Perrin probably were lolling in front of a fire in some palace, swilling wine and telling jokes. He grimaced and rubbed at his forehead as a faint rush of colors seemed to swirl inside his head. That happened lately whenever he thought about either man. He did not know why, and he did not want to know. He just wanted it to stop. If only he could get away from Ebudar. And take the secret of fireworks with him, of course. But he would take escape over the secret any day. Tom and Beslan were still where he had left them, drinking with Luca in front of Luca's elaborately decorated wagon. But he did not join them immediately. For some reason, Luca had taken an instant dislike to Matt Cawthon. Matt returned the favor, but with reason. Luca had a smug, self-satisfied face, and a way of smirking at any woman in sight. And he seemed to think every woman in the world enjoyed looking at him. Like the man was married. Sprawled in a gilded chair he must have stolen from a palace, Luca was laughing and making expansive, lordly gestures to Tom and Beslan, seated on benches to either side of him. Golden stars and comets covered Luca's brilliant red coat and cloak. A tinker would have blushed. His wagon would have made a tinker weep. Much larger than Eludra's work wagon, the thing tinkered. The phases of the moon repeated themselves in silver all the way around the wagon, and golden stars and comets in every size covered the rest of the red and blue surface. In that setting, Beslan looked almost ordinary in a coat and cloak worked in swooping birds. Tom, knuckling wine from his long white mustaches, seemed positively drab in plain bronze-colored wool and a dark cloak. One person who should have been there was not, but a quick glance around found a cluster of women at a nearby wagon. They were every age, from his own up to Gwen, but every one of them was giggling at what they surrounded. Sighing, Matt made his way there. "Oh, just cannot decide," came a voice piping back. "When I look at you, Mercy, your eyes are the prettiest I've ever seen. But when I look at you, yours are. Your lips are ripe cherries, Gillen, and yours make me want to kiss them, Adria. And your neck, Jamine, graceful as a swan's." Swallowing an oath, Matt quickened his pace as much as he could and pushed through the women, muttering apologies left and right. Oliver was in the middle of them, a short, pale boy, posturing and grinning at one woman, then another. That toothy grin alone was enough that any of them might decide to slap his ears off in a moment. "Please forgive him," Matt murmured, taking the boy's hand. "Come on, Oliver. We have to get back to the city. Stop waving your cloak about. He doesn't know what he's saying, really. I don't know where he picks up that sort of thing." Luckily, the women pulled Oliver's hair as Matt led him away. Some murmured that he was a sweet boy, of all things. One slipped her hand under Matt's cloak and pinched his bottom. Women. Once clear, he scowled at the boy, tripping along happily at his side. Oliver had grown since Matt first met him, but he was still short for his years, and with that wide mouth and ears to match, he would never be handsome. "You could get yourself in deep trouble talking to women that way," Matt told him. "Women like a man to be quiet and well-mannered. Maybe a little shy. Cultivate those qualities and you'll do well." Oliver gave him a gaping, incredulous stare, and Matt sighed. The lad had a fistful of uncles looking after him, and every one except Matt himself was a bad influence. Tom and Beslin were enough to restore Oliver's grin. Pulling his hand free, he ran ahead to them laughing. Tom was teaching him how to juggle and play the harp and the flute, and Beslin was teaching him how to use a sword. His other uncles gave him other lessons in a remarkably varied set of skills. Matt intended to start teaching him to use a quarterstaff and the Two Rivers bow once he had his strength back. What the boy was learning from Chelvannon or the Red Arms, Matt did not want to know. Luca rose from his fancy chair at Matt's approach, his fatuous smile fading to a sour grimace. Eyeing Matt up and down, he swept that ridiculous cloak around himself with a wide flourish and announced in a booming voice, "I am a busy man. I have much to do. It may be that I soon will have the honor of guesting the High Lady Suroth for a private showing." Without another word, he strode away holding the ornate cloak with just one hand, so gusts rippled it behind him like a banner. Matt gathered his own with both hands. The cloak was for warmth. He had seen Suroth in the palace, though never closely. As closely as he wanted, though. He could not imagine her giving a moment to Balan Luca's grand traveling show and magnificent display of marvels and wonders, as the streamer strung between two tall poles at the entrance to the show announced in red letters a pace high. If she did, likely she would eat the lions, or frighten them to death. "Has he agreed yet, Tom?" he asked quietly, frowning after Luca. "We can travel with him when he leaves Abu Dar," the weathered man replied. "For a price." He snorted, blowing out his mustaches, and irritably raked a hand through his white hair. "We should eat and sleep like kings for what he wants, but knowing him, I doubt we will. He doesn't think we're criminals, since we're still walking free, but he knows we're running from something, or we would travel some other way. Unfortunately, he does not intend to leave until spring, at the earliest." Matt considered several choice curses. Not until spring? The light knew what Tylan would have done to him, would have him doing by spring. Maybe Vannon stealing horses was not such a bad notion. "Gives me more time for dice," he said, as if it did not matter. "If he wants as much as you say, I need to fatten my purse. One thing you can say for the Shanshan, they don't seem to mind losing." He tried to be careful how long he let his luck run, and he had not faced any threats of having his throat slit for cheating, at least since he had been able to leave the palace on his own feet. At first, he had believed it was his luck spreading, or perhaps being Taviran finally coming in for something useful. Beslin regarded him gravely. A dark, slender man, a little younger than Matt, he had been blithely rakish when Matt first met him, always ready for a round of the taverns, especially if it ended with women or a fight. Since the Shanshan came, he had grown more serious, though. To him, They were very serious business. My mother won't be pleased if she learns I am helping her pretty leave Abu Dhar, Matt. She will marry me to someone with a squint and a mustache like a Tarabonner foot soldier. After all this time, Matt still winced. He could never get used to Tylen's son thinking what his mother was doing with Matt was all right. Well, Beslin did believe she had become a little too possessive. Just a little, mind. But that was the only reason he was willing to help. Beslin claimed Matt was what his mother needed to take her mind off the agreements she had been forced into by the Shonchan. Sometimes Matt wished he was back in the Two Rivers, where at least you knew how other people thought. Sometimes he did. Can we return to the palace now? Ulver said, more a demand than a question. I have a reading lesson with the Lady Roselle. She lets me rest my head on her bosom while she reads to me. A notable achievement, Ulver, Tom said, stroking his mustaches to hide a smile. Leaning closer to the other two men, he pitched his voice to escape the boy's ears. The woman makes me play the harp for her before she lets me rest my head on that magnificent pillow. Roselle makes everyone entertain her first. Beslin chuckled in a knowing way, and Tom stared at him in astonishment. Matt groaned. It was not his leg this time, or the fact that every man in Abu Dhar seemed to be choosing the bosom they rested their heads on, except for Matt Coffin. Those bloody dice had just started tugging again. Something bad was coming his way. Something very bad. Chapter 16. An Unexpected Encounter. The walk back to the city was better than 2 miles, across low hills that worked the ache out of Matt's leg and put it back again before they topped a rise and saw Abu Dhar ahead, behind its extravagantly thick white-plastered wall that no siege catapult had ever been able to break down. The city within was white too, though here and there pointed domes bore thin stripes of color. The white-plastered buildings, white spires and towers, white palaces, gleamed even on a gray winter day. Here and there a tower ended in a jagged top, or a gap showed where a building had been destroyed. But in truth, the Shonchan conquest occasioned little damage. They had been too fast, too strong, and in control of the city before more than scattered resistance could form. Surprisingly, such trade as there was this time of year had hardly faltered with the city's fall. The Shonchan encouraged it, though merchants and ship captains and crews were required to take an oath to obey the forerunners, await the return, and serve those who come home. In practice, that meant largely going about your life as usual, so few objected. The broad harbor was more crowded with ships every time Matt looked at it. This afternoon, it seemed he could have walked from Abu Dhar proper across to the Rahad, a rough quarter he would just as soon never revisit. Often in the days after he first managed to walk again, he had gone down to the docks to stare, not at the vessels with ribbed sails, or the seafolk ships that the Shonchan were re-rigging and manning with their own crews, but at craft flying the golden bees of Ilion, or the sword in hand of Aradaman, or the crescents of Tyr. He no longer did. Today, he barely glanced toward the harbor. Those dice spinning in his head seemed to roar like thunder. Whatever was going to happen, he very much doubted he would like it. He seldom did, when the dice gave warning. Though a steady stream of traffic flowed out of the great arched gateway, and people afoot seemed to be squeezing through to get in, a thick column of wagons and ox carts stretching all the way back to the rise was waiting to enter and hardly moving.
Right back, everyone.
Everyone departing on a horse was Shonchan, whether with skin as dark as one of the sea folk or pale as a Karianan, and they stood out for more than being mounted. Some of the men wore voluminous trousers and odd tight coats with high collars that fit their necks snugly right to the chin, and rows of shiny metal buttons down the front, or flowing elaborately embroidered coats almost as long as a woman's dress. They were of the blood, as were the women in strangely cut riding dresses that seemed made of narrow pleats, with divided skirts cut to expose colorfully booted ankles, wide sleeves that hung to their feet in the stirrups. A few wore lace veils that hid all but their eyes, so their faces were not exposed to the lowborn. Most of the riders, by far, however, wore brightly painted armor of overlapping plates. Some of the soldiers were women, too, though there was no way to tell which, with those painted helmets like the heads of monstrous insects. At least none wore the black and red of the Death Watch Guard. Even other Shanshan seemed nervous around them, and that was enough to warn Matt to walk wide around them. In any case, none of the Shanshan spared so much as a glance for 3 men and a boy slowly walking toward the city along a column of waiting carts and wagons. Well, the men walked slowly. Oliver skipped. Matt's leg was setting their pace, but he tried not to let the others see how much he was leaning on his staff. The dice usually announced incidents he managed to survive by the skin of his teeth. Battles, a building dropping on his head. Tylin. He dreaded what would happen when they stopped this time.
Alright, everyone, I'm gonna call into this live for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Till next time, everyone, y'all stay safe out there.